I am speaking with State Senator Bruce Tarr, as I do almost every week. Hi, Senator. How are you this week?
Hi, Heather. I'm doing great, thanks. How are you today?
I'm good. I'm good.
Good.
There's a little sunshine. The rain has stopped for a little bit.
Well, yeah, I'm actually on Cape Ann, and I know we just had a huge thunderstorm, but I see the sunlight streaming through the windows there, and it's very nice to see.
It is so nice. So I have questions about the way the state is going to spend the American Rescue Plan funds. I still don't understand whether the governor has permission to spend those funds. The legislature is saying, no, we want them in a separate fund and we want to deal with them as we always deal with spending. What's going on with that question?
So it is a bit of a confusing issue, and there's been a fair amount of back and forth going on with regard to it. What initially happened here is that we were one of, I believe, 20 states that were given about $5 billion in discretionary spending by the federal government in recognition of the need that we have because of COVID-19. Now, ordinarily, the other states, I believe, have spent that money through the administrations, through the executive branch. But in this case, the legislature elected to pass legislation that would subject that spending to a budget process that is much like the one we use for the state budget or supplemental spending documents known as supplemental budgets. The governor then returned that piece of legislation with a spending plan that proposed spending the majority of it in one way and then leaving a little less than half of it to the legislature to spend through that budgeting process. The legislature then overrode that amendment that the governor had sent. And so what we're back to now is the bill that the legislature passed, which will subject all of the money except for about $200 million, which was given to the administration in case there's an emergency. But the rest of the money will be subjected to a budgeting process, again, much like what we use for the state budget and other spending documents. And in fact, next week, the House and Senate Committees on Ways and Means will hold their first hearing to take input from the public on how that money should be spent. So it's been a bit of a bumpy road to get here, but where we are now is much like the budgeting process that most people are familiar with.
So I have one other question. There's something called the Coronavirus Local Fiscal Recovery Fund. Now that is separate from the American Rescue Plan funds, is that right?
It is. And that fund was actually created a while ago, and it was created because we anticipated getting federal funding, which we then did, and it went into that fund to be able to be distributed to communities.
So specifically municipal cities and towns.
Yes.
And I think the governor has a map that shows how that money is distributed.
And some of it has been distributed already, yes, and I believe there's some remaining. I'm not sure how much is left. Yes, but that whole account is a remnant of something that happened a while ago. And again, as we were seeing the federal government consider various spending documents, we anticipated one that the proceeds would go into this account, and they did.
Great. So you have just passed, and you're sending it to the governor, Chapter 90, which is this large transportation bill. Do you want to tell us about that?
So I will. So the Chapter 90 bill is usually a rite of spring. We usually try to get it done sometime in either late March or April, or at the very latest May. So it's coming very late this year. The reason we try to do it in those other months is so that we can capture the full breadth of the construction season. And so it's important to understand that the purpose of Chapter 90 is for the state to provide resources to cities and towns for local road and bridge projects. And we had talked a little bit off camera about the earmarking. The reason there is no earmarking in this bill is because Chapter 90 has a statutory formula by which money goes to cities and towns according to how many road miles they have, according to population, and according to other factors. And so it would be completely inappropriate for the legislature to try to usurp what is laid out in the statute. And so this is a program that cities and towns have become accustomed to. It is now on the governor's desk. We had a bit of a difference in the House version of the bill and the Senate version of the bill. Those differences got worked out, and the bill is now on the governor's desk. And just to give you a sense, Heather, generally speaking, over the last number of years, the annual amount for this is $200 million. And it's $200 million that is bonded. And the reason that it's bonded and doesn't come from operating expense is because these are projects that have a useful life generally of longer than 5 years. So it makes sense to preserve cash flow for the state to be able to subject them to bonds at a low borrowing rate and then use the proceeds of those bonds to go out to cities and towns. Now, one other thing that's very interesting about Chapter 90 is that municipalities can accumulate for a few years their Chapter 90 allocation. So if they have a big project they want to do, they don't have to spend and feel pressured to spend all of their Chapter 90 allocation in the year in which it is authorized. We've been trying to clamp down on that a little bit lately because some municipalities had been accumulating very large amounts of money, and then when the bill came due, it was disruptive. But the idea is still the same, that you can accumulate those funds as long as you report that to the state and how much we owe you and what you're planning to spend it on. So that is the bulk of this Chapter 90 bill. But I had mentioned to you that there are some other interesting things, and I consider them to be innovative other things. And so, for instance, there's an account that is intended to help us buy electric vehicles and the infrastructure to charge them. And I believe that one is about $25 million. I have to look here to see. But that was something that I was a very strong proponent of, that as we're thinking about our transportation infrastructure, we need to think about renewable energy. We need to think about reducing carbon emissions. And so there is $25 million in the budget, in the supplemental, not the supplemental, I'm sorry, in the Chapter 90 bill for that. We also have $25 million specifically for municipal small bridges. And the best example that I can think of a small municipal bridge is the one that is on Thatcher Road near the intersection with Bass Avenue that a number of years ago needed to be addressed. That's a small bridge. And so that's an example of that. We also have money, about $25 million, to try to address municipal small traffic bottlenecks, intersections that are problematic, roads, the geometry of which causes bottlenecks, those kind of things. And then also $25 million for transit supportive infrastructure. And the idea here is that if we have, for instance, housing that is near a train station, we ought to be able to provide sidewalks so that the people that are in the housing can get to the train station. And so these are things that are not normally part of Chapter 90 bills, but they give you a sense of where the legislature's mindset is, of trying to think outside of the box and trying to not just maintain what we have, but to also build things that are innovative for the future. Now, all of those things that I just mentioned together are about $125 million. So they're not huge amounts of money, but they're important amounts of money that will be targeted in some important ways over the next few years.
Well, thank you for all that work, particularly the electric vehicles. I do want to say one thing. Please don't touch Rockport Five Corners. We all love that. Okay.
I am quite familiar for Five Corners as a favorite campaigning location, so I don't want its geometry to change either. But I would also say one thing that I left out that's important for Rockport is there is another $25 million in the bill for local rail station improvements, and that could, I emphasize the word could, come into play with regard to Rockport. So that brings a total up to about $150 million of extra money. But 25 million is for local train stations, which are important.
That's great. And speaking of the American Rescue Plan, you found a little issue in this bill.
I did. It was not, this money needs to get out, and it needs to get out now. So I did not want to hold the bill up over this issue, but there was an outside section, which are rare because we try not to do major policy items in the Chapter 90 bill. It's meant to be a very straightforward borrowing bill and send money to the cities and towns bill. But there's a provision that presupposes that we will use some ARPA money for transportation. And I think in the end, we probably will. Mm-hmm. But the problem here was the contradiction between pronouncements that had been made by the House and Senate leadership. Then we referenced this earlier, that all of the ARPA money was going to go through a budgeting process and everyone was going to have input, and we weren't going to spend the money until we had that input. So I took exception to the fact that an outside section was placed in this bill that says ARPA money can be used for transportation infrastructure. Well, first of all, the guidance from the federal government indicates that it can. So the provision has very little effect. But second, I thought it was important to maintain what we said, that we're going to think about everything this money could be used for. Again, will some of it likely be used for transportation? Absolutely. And I hope it does. But it's important that when we make these kind of broad pronouncements, that we try to follow them so the public has the ability to know the process by which money is going to be spent.
Exactly. And the point being that this process, the ARPA process, the American Rescue Plan process, won't begin until next week. And
that's right.
And you have just sent this legislation to the governor. So you did not think it was fair that there was a reference to the American Rescue Plan money in this bill, right?
And I would have said that about any kind of spending where we had made that supposition. And, you know, and part of the issue here, Heather, is that a while ago, I had proposed something before the agreement was made to subject the ARPA money to the budgeting process. I had suggested that we say that we may use it, we would authorize using some of it for the Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund, which is experiencing severe deficits. And to make up for those deficits, we have a huge assessment on employers. Now, we've tried to make that better by essentially borrowing the money over a 20-year period, but we've now given employers essentially a 20-year mortgage for a very large amount of money. So at the time I said, well, why don't we at least authorize some ARPA spending for that to be able to reduce that liability? I was told, no, we have to wait for the process. So you can understand why I was a little bit unhappy when I see a supposition being made about another type of spending. Wow. And again, my objection would have been to any category unless it was every category.
Right, right. Well, good job there.
Oh, thank you. Move forward. You know, one of the important things about being in the minority is to not be obstructive, but to be constructive with criticism. And that's where I put this in that category, that the objection needed to be raised, the point needed to be raised, but we still needed to move forward with this bill.
Very graceful. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
So this is Friday, July 16th, and there was just big news in the State House. Do you want to talk about that?
There was probably one of the bigger news stories that happens every year, and that is the governor has signed the fiscal year 2022 budget. And in fact, I just received a whole host of materials from the governor's office. The most illustrative is probably the signing letter. So when the governor signs a bill like the budget, he usually sends a letter explaining why he's doing what he's doing. And in this case, what's significant is the governor is vetoing very little of this budget. So it's less than $10 million. I think it's actually going to wind up being more in the order of magnitude of about $8 million out of a budget that is roughly 46 billion and some change. I am trying to find that number as we speak, but it was, so the point is that the governor is vetoing very little of the budget. And one of the interesting things is legislators always earmark budgets. We do that for what we consider to be our local priorities. And we did that to the tune of about $90 million in this budget. And by the way, the total as signed is $47.6 billion. So breaking news there. So the governor did not veto any one of the earmarks, did veto, again, somewhere between $8 and $10 million in spending, and also is sending back some amendments on some of our outside sections. So this is unique. We don't usually see this situation, but it's reflective of the fact that we have changed circumstances. So we have a budget surplus. We certainly are going to have a substantial one for the fiscal year that just ended, fiscal year 21. We're projected to have one for fiscal year 2022. And we have seen the $5 billion that we talked about coming from the federal government. And so the governor's point, as best I can read it through his letter, and I've just scanned it, is that we have the money to support these things. And so we are going to support these things. And so that's outstanding. Now, one of the things that's important here is to talk about the stabilization fund. You and I have talked about that before. And one of my concerns has been, we have been depleting the stabilization fund to be able to keep things running and meet our obligations during the COVID-19 pandemic. And my concern has been that the stabilization fund is going to be at less than $1 billion if the budget had gone the way that we predicted, and we had withdrawn money for it to balance the fiscal year 2022 budget. The good news is we're not going to have to do that. And in fact, there is a provision in state law that there's a cap on the tax revenue that we get from capital gains taxes, and everything above that cap goes into the stabilization fund. So at this point, because of all those factors, because we won't be withdrawing from it, because we've had robust capital gains tax revenue, and a number of other factors, we are projecting now the stabilization fund is going to be at a place that is close to, if not more than, $5 billion. And going into the pandemic, we were at about $3.5 billion that we had worked very hard to get to. And so, there is very good news here. In fact, the governor's projecting, just reading, he's projecting that the account will be at $5.8 billion.
That's amazing.
By the end of the fiscal year. So that is quite a turn of events. And it's really good news. Now, I've been around long enough to know that you don't count those dollars before they actually materialize.
That's the stabilization for dollars, yeah.
But the trend is going in a very positive direction.
Yeah, that is wonderful. So we started the pandemic with just over 3 billion.
And 3.5.
Yeah, that's amazing. So I sort of always ask this question. How do you think other New England states are faring compared to Massachusetts? I mean, this is very good news in this budget. And
well, I haven't given that a lot of analysis, but I would say that other states generally in New England and across the country did not have the kind of stabilization fund that we had. And that left them in a worse position. And what has saved them is the amount of federal funding that the federal government has been willing to send in recognition of the COVID-19 pandemic. The difference for us was that we didn't have to wait for a lot of those dollars to maintain continuity of services and to meet our obligations to cities and towns, to education, to other kinds of things. And so we've been in a different position, I would argue in a better position, and coming out of the pandemic, we're going to be in a yet stronger position that most other states haven't had the benefit of.
Well, let's just bring it back to the local level one more time, or again, earmarks. Tell us what kind of special earmarks are in this budget for our community.
So before we get to that, I do want to say that one unique feature of this budget is the establishment of a reserve fund of about $300 million for the Student Opportunity Act. You may recall we had to postpone funding that during the pandemic. This is the first budget where we're putting significant amounts of money into it. But because we have the resources, we're actually setting up a stabilization fund just for education. And I think that's very significant. Now, when it comes to earmarks, I also have to give credit to my colleagues in the House, particularly Representative Ferranti, because this is her first year of being the vice chair of the House Committee on Ways and Means. And this is the first budget that she was negotiating as a member of the conference committee. So Cape Ann had some unique benefits here because she was on the conference committee. And as the minority leader, I appoint a member of the conference committee. And so we had two folks that were looking out for our interests. And I think what I'm about to tell you will reflect that and the diligence of a lot of folks. So one thing that, again, was a strong priority for both of us, but that Representative Ferranti put in the House version of the budget was $197,000 for the Gloucester Marine Genomics Institute to work with our Division of Marine Fisheries to do groundbreaking research on what's happening in our ocean and to look at the DNA of the various fish stocks. And that information will be critical in managing our fisheries in the future. This is information we couldn't have dreamed of having just 10 years ago. And so there's money in the budget for that. There is money for the Grace Center. There is money for Wellspring, organizations that we are always trying to be supportive of. And also some funding that we were able to get that came through a Senate amendment that we had offered for battery-powered extrication tools, the so-called Jaws of Life for the Gloucester Fire Department. Very important tools to have. We are trying to get them for all of our departments, and that's important. When we come to Essex, something that's been important there is working on riverway restoration, both in the Essex River and also in the rivers that are connected to Chabaco Lake. And so we have $20,000 for Essex, and at town meeting, they had appropriated $10,000 to match any state grant that might come forward. Well, now it is. And so some good partnership there and good work on that. And something else, Heather, that's important, that is an effort that involves all 4 Cape Ann communities, is looking at climate change. We have a very, very robust committee that is working on that I'm a member of, Representative Ferranti is a member of, and many people are. And that group came up with something called Confronting the Challenges of Climate Change, to look at the impacts in the 4 communities and try to come up with strategies to address them. And in this budget, we were able to put $50,000 to be able to really drill down into that work, because this is something where we need pro-action to get out ahead of what's coming our way. Particularly, I think we all saw in the newspapers, and it was reported in the Gloucester Daily Times, that NOAA just released a report about high tide flooding and how it's becoming more persistent and more aggressive. And so trying to get out ahead of these things is important, and we're able to put some money in the state budget to do just that.
Anything else we need to know about the budget, or what you're doing next week, or what you're doing on vacation?
I wish I had an answer to the last question, but let me just say that I would anticipate that next week we will take up the few vetoes that the governor has issued. One of those is particularly important to me because years ago, the administration created a committee to study hate crime and to try to come up with not only statistics, but ways to address it. It's a subject that's been very important to me. So in the Senate, I added a provision to codify that commission so that it would be in existence regardless of who is the governor into perpetuity. And the Senate unanimously endorsed that. It made it through the conference committee. The governor wants us to consider changes to the composition of it, so he's sending it back, but I'm confident that we can work that out. So that'll be something that I'll be working on next week. I suspect we'll take up all of these vetoes. And then, Heather, as you alluded to with the reference to vacation, is that we will go into informal session most likely for the month of August. So the next couple of weeks will be particularly busy as we try to wrap up some things. We may see a couple of other bills, but I don't think we're going to see anything really substantial. I think we may see some discussion of sports betting, for instance, over the next couple of weeks. But other than that, I think we'll be trying to tie up all the things that I just talked about, bring them to a finish point, and then be able to stop and go into informal session for the month of August.
Mm. And I understand that there have been some decisions made about how the Senate will be meeting after Labor Day.
Well, we have a committee that's working on that, actually, and I'm very pleased to be on that committee. I'm working on it with my counterpart, the Senate Majority Leader, Senator Cynthia Cream from Newton, and we're trying to sort that out. But we know that we certainly won't be opening the State House until at least after Labor Day. And the reason for that is because we want to get it right. We don't want to have a false start. We don't want to open the building and have a problem and then have to shut it down again. So we're thinking about that and thinking about how our staffs are going to operate. You know, we've learned that we can work in a hybrid model, and with some folks coming into the State House, some folks not. We're still trying to sort all that out. But I can tell you that the mood at the State House, to the extent that I can tell you what it is very much about trying to get people back into the building and back onto the floors of the House and the Senate. It's going to take us a little while longer, and the Senate president issued a statement about that yesterday. But I think we're making good progress, and I would say that technology will play a role for that future, but in-person activity at the State House is definitely something that's a priority. It's a real honor to be able to do this on behalf of the people of the Commonwealth and the people of our region. And I really appreciate the chance to explain it so that folks know the information in a way maybe that's more than they might get in other sources. So appreciate the opportunity to do that, and always the chance to talk with you and talk on a beautiful afternoon on K-band.
Great. All right. Well, we will see you soon.
Thanks, Heather.